Please give a warm welcome to our first speaker, Dr. Craig Gedye, medical oncologist at the Calvary, Newcastle, and researcher at HMRI. He will be speaking about any up-and-coming treatments for brain cancer. Thank you, Craig.
You're going to hear some great work today from my dear colleagues, Dr. Lyon and Dr. Fay, and some of the work that they're doing. But what I thought we'd start off with is just a little bit of talk about clinical trials in general and what they are and why they are the way they are and how they're sometimes a little bit difficult, sometimes a bit challenging, and then what we're thinking about to try and make them better, and some of the clinical trials that we've been running in Newcastle, just as an example, and some of the ideas that we've put up. Most of them we haven't got money for, but we've been able to get them up and have a chat about them and get them moving. So the kind of movements that we're trying to get through to do better clinical trials. So first off, some disclosures. When you're working in this field, you do get to talk to pharmaceutical companies a lot, and they want to give you money, and so I don't feel really comfortable taking that money, so we give it to the university. Sometimes they want to get you to conferences, which is good because then you get to talk to people who have got the purse strings in big international situations, so you can get money for trials. And I've managed to generate about $4 million of clinical trials in Australia from going to those meetings, so I'm grateful for that support. I've managed to get, as I said, some money from a number of companies. I consult for a clinical trials company, but just sort of advise them on their clinical trials. Mike and I and John, who will speak later, are on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the Mark Hughes Foundation, so we have a big burden of responsibility to do really great stuff with the funds that Mark and Kirralie and all of you keep raising. And the clinical trials group that I'm chair of, one of the subcommittees, is the one where we're doing most of the trial work at the moment, but that gives us a great platform for thinking about how we're going to get this moving in brain cancer as well. So the first thing to say is that we're doing really well with cancer. The last few decades have seen a dramatic improvement in survival for many, many cancers. And a large part of this is why we do clinical trials. A large part of this is that we learn how to use treatments better, we invent new treatments, we give the treatments at the right time, and suddenly things change. And so we've seen dramatic improvements in the survival of some cancers. But if you go back down to the bottom, we're not seeing those kinds of benefits in brain cancer. And so that's, we've learned, we've got our apparatus for doing these things, so now we've got to really push forward with brain cancer. So some questions about clinical trials, and I think this is the sort of most of my talk today is just, to talk about what a clinical trial is and why we do it and so forth. And so I've tried to sort of address a number of these questions in no particular order, because I kept changing the way that the slides were set out before I gave the talk. And there's some really good resources which I've picked some bits out of. So the Cancer Council's got a really great resource on understanding what clinical trials are. And the American NIH site, the NCI site, cancer.org, has also got a really great website to look at. So the first question is, what is a clinical trial? Well, it can be anything really. It's got lots and lots of things, but essentially it's a study where you do an experiment where you test an idea or a treatment or a drug or a device in a group of people. So that could be things like, do vitamins stop cancer from developing? So that's a prevention study. Unfortunately, the answer to that question was no. In fact, it made it worse. Vitamin E makes you more likely to get lung cancer if you're a smoker, for example. Can a blood test find a cancer early? That's a detection trial. So you're trying to figure out whether a different blood test helps you find a cancer earlier. Does a different X-ray help us understand a cancer or treat it better? So there's a new kind of scan that we use in some people with brain cancer, which there's proposals to use that kind of scan to plan the radiation as opposed to the MRIs that we're using at the moment. Does a new chemotherapy, and that's sort of because I'm a medical oncologist, I'm mostly involved with the chemotherapies and the drugs. That's mostly where my work is centred, and what we'll talk about a lot further. And then, can we do things that improve quality of life? So, for example, we've got a study now at the moment that if you're taking chemotherapy and the standard treatments for nausea and vomiting are not helping you, we've got the opportunity of giving you a very purified, very pure form of cannabis to see whether or not that will help you with those symptoms. So there's all sorts of things that can be a clinical trial. So what is not a clinical trial? So the first thing that's not a clinical trial is you're not a guinea pig. Okay, it's not an issue of using people to do tests. It's really complete opposite. It's you spend a lot more time talking to people who might think about taking a clinical trial. It takes up to more than 3 times as long for me to see someone who's on a clinical trial just to explain all of the aspects of it. The second thing is you're not on a hamster wheel, although we do know that exercise is good for people with cancer and to prevent cancer. So everybody will be doing some star jumps later to get up. And you don't force to do crazy things like eat lettuce, although again, probably eating vegetables is a good idea. The other things that are not a clinical trial, it's not always some unknown drug. It's often a existing drug in a different way or using it better. They're not compulsory. It's always entirely optional, and no one's going to get shitty with you if you don't want to take a clinical trial. You do, and then you stop. It's always. It's not irreversible. It's not irrevocable, and it shouldn't be expensive either. I mean, the whole point of a clinical trial is that we don't make it any more burdensome for people. So we do everything we can to support people who are on trials. And it's not necessarily a last resort or a desperation play. It can often be the first best treatment for people is to consider a clinical trial. And we'll talk about placebos or no treatment a little bit later. So the first question is, why do we do clinical trials? And why don't we just give everybody a new treatment? And the answer to that, of course, is the cane toad. So the cane toad was a clinical trial. It was a clinical trial of introducing one species into Australia to control another imported species, and we know how well that turned out. And the problem is that doctors are just as bad as everybody else at having great ideas and thinking, oh, this is a great idea, and getting carried away with an idea and then trying to implement it, when in actual fact, our brains hold us back. The way we're not that far out of trees or caves. Some of us seem a little closer than that. So our brains have limitations, and one of the limitations we have is that we get caught up with ideas and we get biases. So we're more likely to ignore some evidence and get excited about a pet theory than actually testing it. And that one's particularly called the confirmation bias. So whatever evidence we find that supports our ideas, we overvalue that, and the evidence that downgrades ideas, we just discount it in our heads. So the key thing always is to be objective and to actually entertain questions properly, answer them properly, not get carried away, not jump on the bandwagon for a new thing, and likewise not throw away old ideas because they may be true. Let's answer them. The other thing is that we do treat in clinical trials because sometimes ideas get a life of their own. So can I have a show of hands, please? So there's a statement there that carrot juice improves your eyesight and especially night vision. Who's heard that? Who knows that story? Everybody knows that carrots improve their night vision. Does everybody know that when that evidence or when that story was first started? Does anybody know that?
Yeah, during the start just after the start of the Second World War.
It was just after the start of the Second World War. So there was a big effort to say your night sight is important. Our troops should eat carrots. And do you know really why that was done, sir?
From what I read about it, it was done to the Germans think that the British were developing a radar system for the aircraft.
So the
And the Air Force, they put the story out that the Air Force was feeding their pilots carrots to improve their night.
So a very careful grey lie established by MI5 during World War II to explain why suddenly the English were able to shoot down the Luftwaffe across the English Channel before they were able to drop their bombs in the UK. the development and invention of radar was obscured by the lie that carrots improve your night vision. So we have all of these things that we know that just ain't so. And so a round of applause for my historian colleague in the front. Thank you. So recognising that even doctors who think they're smart are actually susceptible to these kinds of problems where we think about things, we think we know things. That's why we do clinical trials. So why do patients take part in clinical trials? So when you go and ask patients why they take clinical trials, it's often for very, very obvious reasons. And the first reason is because it might help someone else. And that's the first thing just about everybody says to me. And it's always very humbling to hear that someone say that. The obvious next reason is self-interest. Is it the best available treatment for me? And then the third one is a little bit humbling as well. It's because the patient trusts the doctor. So again, I guess that's why we spend a lot of time talking to people about trials and making sure they really are signed up and know what they're up for, because people do trust us a lot. And I guess that's very humbling to have earned that trust. Scientific research, all sorts of other reasons. Now, so there's lots of good reasons to take clinical trials. There's also reasons why people fear taking part in clinical trials. And the first one is that they're worried that it'll be less effective than the standard treatment. And so the responsibility for us there is to design the clinical trials really well so that people get at least the best standard treatment, plus they might get something else. The fear of getting a placebo, but we'll talk about why sometimes that is necessary. Being treated like a guinea pig. Again, we should do more exercise and eat more vegetables, but there's no cages. And travelling distance, that's a really tough one. And again, we're particularly in Australia, and lots of people, including groups here in Newcastle, trying to figure out ways of actually getting clinical trials to people everywhere. And health through insurance is a big issue in the US. And hopefully it will never be an issue here. So just a few sort of single slides now to talk about some other questions that people ask me about clinical trials. So what does the word phase mean? So have you heard of a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial? So phase is just our way of describing how far through the idea of testing the drug the drug might be. So a phase 1 trial tests the safety of a drug. Is it safe to give to people? So when you translate that from doctorese into English, it means does it hurt? Phase 2 is really starting to look to see whether it works, efficacy. So does it hurt, does it help? And then phase 3, you really think the drug actually probably helps some people, so you're really up for testing if it's any better than the standard treatment. And so that's comparative effectiveness. And so that's how much does it help? So does it hurt, does it help, how much? And then phase 4 studies are then the drugs in the real world. We might have access to it, the PBS might reimburse it. We go back and test it again. Does it really help? Was the clinical trial that the pharmaceutical company ran really an accurate measure, or in the real world does the drug actually not work as well as we hoped it would? And there's a really big problem is that sometimes the people that we end up selecting for a clinical trial are usually triathletes and robust and really great people, and then when we try and get the drug into the community, it doesn't work nearly as well as we hoped it would. So those are the trials that the pharma doesn't want us to run, but we run them anyway. So that's what phase means, and there's a lot of steps to get through there. So the next question was, why do we sometimes need a placebo? Who's heard of the Hawthorne effect? Anybody heard of the Hawthorne effect? No industrial psychologists in the room? No. So look, there was a study in the 1930s about whether or not it was better to run a factory with bright lights, costing you a lot of electricity, but where the workers could see what they were doing, versus dim lights, where you spent less money in electricity, and you told the workers they would be more comfortable because the lights wouldn't be so bright. And the result of that study was that the productivity of the workers was highest when you were studying them. So as soon as you pay attention to someone, they do better for you. It's what we do with kids and dogs, right? It's what we should do with kids and dogs. We pay attention to them, they do better. And it's the same on a clinical trial. We do spend a lot more time with people on a clinical trial. You see more people. And just by being on a clinical trial, you do better. So that even the people on just by nature of being on a trial makes life longer and better for people, particularly with cancer. So we do need a placebo because sometimes just the mere act of studying people makes things better. So we have to prove that a drug is effective. Now, if there is a placebo in a study, there's got to be a standard therapy there as well. Sometimes that's nothing. Sometimes if we don't have a treatment for a particular person at a particular time, the right thing to do is just to watch and wait and see them every so often. But sometimes it is a standard treatment plus a placebo. The next concept I wanted to talk about is blinding. So it's not actually just because the doctor doesn't know what's going on, but it's we sometimes have clinical trials where we don't tell the doctor what the treatment the patient's on, and likewise we don't tell the patient what treatment they're on, because again the placebo effect or the effect of a placebo is so strong in some situations that people can do up to 30% better, depending on the health situation, if they think they're on a treatment. So you have to blind people to the treatment to know exactly what's going on. Now that's really relevant in brain cancer because of a very, this treatment. Has anybody heard of this treatment for brain cancer? This is called Novocure's Optune treatment. So this is a treatment that sounds nuts, right? It sounds nuts. You shave your head and you put electrodes all over your head and you run electric currents through your head continuously, 23 hours a day, forever. No thanks? No thank you, no. And it works in a test tube and it works in a mouse, and it looks like it worked in the first small clinical trials a bit. But when they came to the big clinical trial, they did a clinical trial where one group of people got this thing on their head all the time, and the other group of people just had standard treatment. So there was no blinding. Everybody knew what treatment everybody had. And there is a small difference, which the company is now using in the US and in some countries in Europe to sell this as a treatment. But it's really struggling to get legs here in Australia because there's the big flaw in the clinical trial. And so both of those people there could be on that clinical trial. There's the person on the left who's on the control group, person on the right who's got the electrodes all over their head 24 hours, 23 hours a day. So we just don't know whether or not the benefit in that trial is because of the direct current alternating, switching rapidly across their brains and the electric current stopping the cancer cells from dividing, which sounds like nonsense, but may be true. But we just don't know because the person on the left didn't get shaved head, electrodes, the machine plugged in, but was blinded with not having the electric currents going. So we're sort of stuck now because the company doesn't want to go back and do that study, and we can't afford the money to do it. I don't know. Because we don't have this, I haven't looked into it very, very deeply. I think the electric currents are quite small, so I don't think there's been any increase in seizures. If there was lots of seizures, I think it probably would have died. But this treatment is for sale. Yeah, and for $400,000 a year, it can be yours. The next question that sometimes people ask me about clinical trials is why does it take so long to get a new drug? And look, the answer is that, if you're starting from scratch, if you're starting from an idea and then doing the chemistry and then the biochemistry and then the experiments in cancer cells in the dish, and then you go to a mouse and then you see if you can turn the drug into something that a human being could take, it does take decades for that process to work. So it's just a very long time. And pharma will show you this, and they'll say, we'll start with 10,000 different chemicals, and maybe only 250 of them will get through, and then, we lose so many at each step. What pharma tends to do is then, as soon as they see one that's actually got to a clinical trial, they'll subvert that whole process and they'll invent something that's, a slightly different flavour. They'll invent Pepsi instead of Coke, and then try and sell it as something different. But so they won't go through all this business. They'll sidestep this way, which is why true innovations actually take a little bit of time, because pharma's business model is best to just try and make lots of copies of the same thing rather than actually investing all the time and effort into trying to find something new. But it's still, the whole process takes 10 to 15 years. The other question someone's asked me is, why do clinical trials sometimes have to be so big? Why can't we just do small clinical trials? And I'm talking to companies at the moment trying to convince them to give me money and drugs to see whether cannabis helps brain cancer. And they say, why can't you just do a study in 5 people? Well, no, because that's not how mathematics works. So when you do a clinical trial, it's pure statistics. You'll get a variation of some people who have this outcome and that outcome, and then if you do enough people, you'll start to see you get that normal curve, that bell curve, right? And you can make the bell curve sharper or flatter depending on how many people you put, how many times you measure what you're looking at. So the bigger the number of things you measure. So if you measure 2,500 things, you can get a nice steep bell curve. But if you just measure about 100 things, you get a very flat bell curve. So the number of people that you need to have on a clinical trial tells you the degree of accuracy of what you can measure something with. And because you're trying to compare 2 things that are bell curves, you want to be able to have the right number of people here to figure out, if you can actually say if one treatment's better than another. And you end up getting this sort of curve here that really, when you want to do a clinical trial, you want to have about 80% power for something, so that even if you're looking at something that's only changing things a little bit, you need an enormous number of people to be on the clinical trial. If you've got something that works really well, like an appendicectomy, cutting out someone's appendix before antibiotics, you only need to treat 2 people to prove that it actually works. But if you've got, like breast cancer drugs, we've got clinical trials of 4,000 women to try and prove that one thing might be 10% better than the other thing. So it's just, unfortunately, mathematics, which underpins physics, which underpins the universe, is the way it is. And so sometimes clinical trials have to be quite big. Who can take a clinical trial? So this is a challenge. Why can't everybody go on a clinical trial? So this is one of the challenges of why only some people can be on a clinical trial. So this is one of my clinical trials in kidney cancer. And to be on the clinical trial, you have to be all of the green things and none of the red things. And this is just an average clinical trial. So to make sure that we've got the people that are the same as each other on the clinical trial, they have to be relatively uniform. So you have to have all of this thing and none of that thing. So it's called exclusion and inclusion criteria. And it does make it really hard sometimes, because sometimes that means we can't get people onto a trial. The other thing I just wanted to sort of speak to, and again why we're working hard to make things simpler, is on paper, a clinical trial is, you have an idea, you write the idea, you talk to doctors, they will get approved, we talk to the patients, we do the treatment, all the data is entered, and then we find out, we talk about it at a conference, and then, yippee, there's fireworks and we make money out of the drug. That's fantastic. That's how a clinical trial works. Actually, clinical trials in reality have so many steps that they've become monsters in and of themselves. And this guy gave a talk a couple of years ago in New South Wales, and I'm still trying to digest what he was saying, because it was so mind-blowing. But the number of steps sometimes in clinical trials, that there can be hundreds of processes within a clinical trial, which is another thing that slows us down. So we're trying to think of ways of making that much, much more streamlined, so that we can do trials that answer questions properly, but don't stop everything with a roadblock. The other thing that's a big challenge to clinical trials, and this is, again, another challenge that we're trying to address nationally and locally, is that people basically don't get to be involved with them. So the argument is that 3 to 5% of people actually get onto cancer clinical trials, but up to 85% of people are unaware they could even participate. So part of that is awareness, so understanding that it's not just a desperation play, all the things I've said to you today, that it's actually if we can get the trial organised for us, then it's often the best first thing that we can offer to people. And some pharma companies reckon that 20% of people might be eligible out of those 85% of people with the cancer, but only 3 to 5% of people get the drugs. We'll see. We're trying, as I said, we're trying all sorts of different ways to try and figure out how to make that work better. The other thing that's a problem with clinical trials is that even though they're really important in the way we actually move treatment forwards, we've been polluted by commercial imperatives. So a lot of stuff that's actually published is not correct. It's not true, and it's not helpful. And part of the problem is industry sponsorship when it's left unchecked. I mean, we work with pharma a lot, but when it's left unchecked, they can end up doing trials that are a little bit skewed and get the answer that's good for their shareholders and maybe not necessarily for the patients. So, for example, when we've got clinical trials that may be comparing two treatments, so maybe we want to compare Pepsi versus Coke, it's really hard to get the companies to give us both Pepsi and Coke at the same time so that we can compare them. And in fact, when you actually look at it, when we're comparing drugs head to head, it's usually the same company's drugs. They're very, very unlikely. There's very few lines here there's lots of lines going backwards and forwards to the same company, but very few lines where they'll compare to each other. And in fact, 97% of the time, a pharmaceutical trial will get a favourable result. Why did you do the trial if you knew that it was going to be a favourable result? I guess that's the challenge we face. The other challenge that we face, and this is why, as much as there's a lot of power in pharma trials to moving forwards, why investigators like Dr. Lynham, like Dr. Fay, like many of our colleagues around Australia want to try and drive clinical trials from the ground up rather than from the top down, is that the wrong questions sometimes get asked in clinical trials. So this is a clinical trial in kidney cancer. This is one of my favourite things that I yip on about. James has probably seen this slide about 700 times. But this is a clinical trial of comparing Pepsi versus Coke. But the questions that were asked in the clinical trial was, did you burp after drinking the Pepsi compared to the Coke? Oh, well, therefore the Pepsi is better. So these are two drugs for kidney cancer, and they sort of look about the same when you look at the number of people who are still alive. And then if you look at how sore your feet are on the drugs, and I kid you not, that was one of the important things that they thought was important to put up. How sore are your feet? Well, on one drug, you have slightly sore feet, and on the other one, you have slightly less sore feet, so therefore, our drug is better. And that was the result of the clinical trial. And that's really frustrating when you stop and think about this clinical trial, which was, you can't read the details. This was run in Canada. This was run with those two same drugs, but compared to a third treatment. So here's the third treatment in green. So those are the two drugs that I talked about that I had in the last slide, those two different tablet drugs for kidney cancer. Those are those two kidney cancer drugs there. So again, they look about the same as each other as in the last trial. But look at this treatment. How much better is that? That looks amazing. Do you know what that treatment is in green? That's just one of those drugs used properly. So using that drug in a better way, giving the tablet in a different way, and in fact in a way that respects the patient more and listens to how their symptoms are going, you can actually improve the survival of that group of patients from about 20 months up to about 38 months. 18 months of extra life. Bit stupid, isn't it? Then the next part of the wrong question is, again, same kind of drugs in kidney cancer, but instead of giving the drugs all the time, they give people 3-month holidays off the drugs. Kidney cancer is a lot less aggressive than brain cancer, so you can get away with, the timing might be different, but taking breaks off the treatment might be a way of actually keeping the benefit of the drug effective. And yes, the cancer gets bigger each time you stop the drug, but it keeps responding to treatment. This is an individual patient's situation, and they're just kept in a little Groundhog Day. Their cancer's kept in a little Groundhog Day. So not only do they get holidays off the treatment, but they also potentially can spread that effectiveness of the treatment out over a longer period of time. It's a fascinating idea. But again, this is individual investigators have to ask these questions because pharma's not interested. So what can we do? We can ask the right questions. We can find new ways to do those trials in our hospitals. We can try and offer more trials to more patients and refer more patients to more trials. We need to do better investigator trials, and we need to do better cooperative trials, and we need to do the right pharma trials, and we keep engaging to try and teach them to ask questions that are good for people. I talked about that. One of the things that's important we've taken part in here is this was invented in New South Wales, but we've joined on as well. But it's the idea of there's a clinical trials app. So this is on your phone, and if I don't have the right trial for you here, I try and find one that might be right for you somewhere else. And so I send people to North Sydney, West Sydney, sometimes South Sydney, but get people to other places that might have a treatment that might be better for them. So just in the last few minutes that I've got, just a sort of a mention of some of the brain cancer trials we've run here in Newcastle. We've just had a lull, but we've got another one starting soon. We've got another 2 starting soon. And then some of the ideas that I've put up to show you sort of the way we're thinking, but again, a lot of these haven't got forward for lack of funding at this stage. So the first trial that I wanted to talk about, we got a drug that was for people where a cancer had spread to their brain. So not primary brain cancer, but where the cancer has spread to their brain. So things like melanoma, lung cancer, breast cancer. And the idea of this trial is that when a cell or a cancer cell or any other cell grows, the first thing it does is it reorganises. It's got all of the DNA in your cell is in a little bucket in the middle, and the first thing you do that it reorganises is to split that up and split it into 2 cells. And so this drug works by just stopping that first step in that cycle. So it stops that turnover. And by stopping that turnover, the idea was it stops how the cancer grows. So we got some patients onto that trial. Now, in terms of brain cancer, the standard treatment for brain cancer, as many of you know, is the surgeon does the best operation they can and cut out as much of the cancer as they can. The radiation doctors, like Dr. Fay, get people lined up to give radiation treatment. And then the least important, and James and I are the least important doctors in terms of brain cancer, we give a chemotherapy drug called typical temozolomide. So we give a chemotherapy drug at the same time as the radiation treatment and then afterwards as well. So that's the standard treatment. So one of the trials that we were able to do a couple of years ago now is a double immunotherapy trial. So this is a drug that has got an immunotherapy drug at one end and an immunotherapy drug at the other end, and we were able to get a few people with brain cancer onto that study. It wasn't. It was a phase 1 study, so we're really looking to see if it hurt anybody, but we already started to see that it helped some people. The people that this actually helped were people with liver cancer. And so this drug's moving ahead in liver cancer. But in the first instance, we were allowed to give it to all sorts of different people with different cancers to find out where it might help. So immune therapy drugs work by trying to turn the immune system on and get the immune system to attack the cancer. So they work a bit differently to chemotherapy. So that's one of the trials. The second trial was a trial where in people who've had the standard treatment and then the cancer has come back, that we can add this other drug, which is it's now got a name actually. We can add this other drug that homes in for some people with some cancers. So some people with brain cancer have a molecule on the surface of the cancer called EGFR, or in this case, it's got a variation of EGFR. So it's a target that's on the surface of the cancer cell that's not on any other parts of the body. And so we've got a drug that homes in and targets that. It's an antibody, but it's got a payload. It's got a bomb attached to it. It's got a chemotherapy drug that's too toxic to give to human beings. Except when you give it in a very targeted fashion, it delivers the chemotherapy right to the cancer cell. It's a great idea. This trial is reported enough to say that there's probably a little bit of benefit, but what it has done is let us be part of a trial that we did very well, and we got 10 people onto that trial from a lot of work, where we added that same drug in, just as you're starting your radiation treatment. And some people in this room have been on that trial. Thank you. And so that trial's coming up to a close. We've got all the customers onto it. We're seeing what happens, and we're waiting with bated breath to see what happens. But it's a really interesting idea, and I'm really hopeful that by finding finding the right group of people for this drug, that this may actually be a new treatment. We'll see. We don't know. We just don't know. We've also had trials where we have a new tablet that works only for some people whose cancers have a specific change in their genes. So this is an idea, again, this is another way of representing what the DNA in your cells look like. But if two parts of the DNA get chopped up and then reform, it's something that's called a gene fusion. So there's a fusion of two things together. And so you can find those kinds of weird fusions in all sorts of different kinds of cancer. So you end up having to look at lots and lots of different people. We did find one person with a brain cancer for this study and use this drug. So it's another little idea that's moving forward, but it's very hard to find. It's a needle in a haystack trying to find these customers. And then we've also got the same, I talked about that drug before, this is the trial that's coming. The company obviously believes that this drug is actually going to move forwards, so we've got another clinical trial coming because the major side effect of this drug is that it affects people's vision. So we've got different ways of protecting their eyes when they're on the drug, so we're testing that. So it'll give us another way of offering that treatment to people. And so some of the trials that I've been involved in the development here and locally and for COGNO. So one of them was actually now open. It's a treatment where we give people the standard treatment. They might be having a short course of radiotherapy, and we give them one of these immune therapy drugs that tries to turn on the immune system. And then we start that after the radiation is completed. And so I got to name this study because I thought up the best acronym. So the acronym is NUTMEG. And so the trial's called NUTMEG, and we've just started, I think, with our first patient today, and we're very grateful for Dr. Fay and all of the radiation oncologists who, if they meet a patient who's going to get that short course of radiotherapy, to consider whether that customer might want to be on this trial. And then this is a study that's under development with COGNO, sort of just in general, but it's the idea of trying to figure out if we can do clinical trials within our existing hospitals without investing an enormous amount of money, but perhaps just doing little variations in treatment. So there's what standard treatment might look like. You have an operation, you have your radiotherapy with some chemotherapy drugs, and you have some chemotherapy afterwards. And there may be variations. Maybe the way, when you take the drugs is important. Maybe we should keep taking the chemotherapy. Maybe we should start as soon as the operation's been done. Maybe you shouldn't have any days off. Who knows? There's lots of variations of using old drugs better, that maybe we can find a better way of doing that. Or we could add different drugs. Maybe we can add maybe this is where we can add the cannabis in. Who knows? Maybe we can do some other things, and there's some other ideas of adding different immune therapy drugs or other ideas. So it's trying to figure out ways that we don't need to rely on pharma funding to do trials, and to figure out cunning ways of bringing those trials into our standard practice. Here's another one, still waiting, this one's not dead, but it's still waiting on feedback from the company. There's a drug that's used for leukemia, it was actually invented in Australia, so it's an Australian story, but it's a really interesting drug that works for some people with leukemia really well. And the target is in brain cancer, so I've thrown up the idea to the company and say, look, give me the drug, we'll try it and be with brain cancer. And they're a good company to work with. They're saying, look, we're not sure if it'll actually get into people's brains first. There's a barrier, but we'll get back to you. So we'll see what comes of that. And I mentioned cannabis. So cannabis is a tough thing. It's all on the news at the moment. We're going to have the medicinal cannabis thing. It's going to be amazing. We're going to be the biggest exporter in the world. It's incredible. And James will be talking about it as well. And then there's this stuff on the internet that, did you know that it shrinks tumours and it's amazing, and the government's lied about it, and da-da-da-da-da. So there's lots of hyperbole. And there's also grains of truth. There's probably grains of truth in there. So the target for cannabis is this molecule here. It's on the surface of brain cancer cells. You can see that these are pieces of brain cancer, and all of them are brown because they're expressing this. So the target's there. And the idea's there, but trying to figure out how we can get cowboy cannabis companies to give us the money to do the trial, that's another thing. So we'll see where we get to. This is the idea I talked about before in kidney cancer, but it's the idea of trying to intelligently use these drugs that block blood vessels. So you can give these drugs to people with cancers, and they can cut off the blood supply to a cancer. That's nice. But when you give a drug to a patient, you end up selecting out some of the cancer cells that are most resistant to treatment. and they are what end up growing out. So you've always got this arms race with a cancer. So it's the idea of, when you give a standard treatment, the drug might work for a while, but then it starts to fail. And it's the idea of adaptively dosing that drug, giving it for a while, taking your foot off the accelerator, going back on. That's an idea that we've proposed to a couple of companies, but again, it's been hard to get access to the drugs and the funding to do that. And then finally, we've thrown a whole lot of ideas in the air to different companies to, say, combine anti-angiogenic drugs with immunotherapy drugs, with different kinds of immunotherapy drugs and anti-angiogenic agents, combining immunotherapy with a repurposed myeloma drug, with a drug that affects the tumour microenvironment, and the latest one that we're still waiting on feedback for is a drug that affects DNA repair, so a drug that interferes with that to see if that'll combine. So just to summarise, clinical trials are essential to improve cancer treatment. They can be the first and they might be the best treatment option for people. At the very worst, if you're on the placebo, you've got even more nice people looking after you. So you don't just have your cancer care nurse, but you've also got the clinical trial coordinators looking after you. They're a lot of work and they're a lot of money, and they're very cumbersome in some ways, but the challenge is there, and we're learning new ways of making them work better and how to do the trials differently. And there's a huge team needed. We need patients and their families first and foremost. The nurses, the coordinators, the technicians who do everything, the data managers, the logistics, even the doctors are involved. And we do, as much as I've railed against pharma, we do need them because if we're going to use new drugs, we've got to work with them. So, and of course sponsors, support for the trials is essential, and so we keep reaching out in different ways to try and get those supported. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm unfortunately going to have to shoot away, but James is going to be here after his talk and give some talks. Great, thanks for your attention.